Hello, everyone. This is Dr. J, and I am delighted to have as my guest today, Danica Bloom, USA Today bestselling author. And we're both in the hot seat. I just want to make that very clear. We're doing a live critique today of her book, Second Breath, Dazzled by My Blonde Date. And it's going to be interesting because, and I really want her to know I'm nervous about this, to take an entire novel and look at this process and tie it together for my work in Scenes with Sex template to strengthen a romance story. So that's how I want you to hear the information today. This is all about how to strengthen your story with this particular template. So this event today is going to highlight the macro and the micro understanding of my upcoming book, How to Write Scenes with Sex, A Writer's Guide to Writing Sexuality, Learning How to Craft Sexually Holistic Characters for Meaning in the Story and in the Scene. So Danica, I thought that we'd have a conversation about some of the elements as it applies to your story. You have seen me talk about it. You've seen my draft manuscript. You've taken a master class on the topic. What do you hope to gain today from this conversation?
Oh, my Lord. Okay. I know that, and because I know there's somebody here, so we've got other folks who are here who, if in the recording you won't be able to see, but I know I have a friend writer here who does not go back and edit books, but one thing I'm hoping doesn't happen is that I want to go back and totally rewrite that book. So that's kind of my top of mind is that. What I'm hoping will happen is that in my current manuscript, setting aside all the things that I could have done better in 10 previous books, is that my scenes with sex are so natural to the reader. They feel that the reader feels like the scene couldn't have gone any other way from a heart point of view, I guess, of course, that's the way those characters reacted. I think that's what I'm hoping for, is that there's none of that. You know, when you read a romance novel and there's a sex scene and you think, where the heck did that come from? I don't ever want to have that experience for a reader in my books.
Well, I'm tickled that you said that. It brings up 2 points. Number one, my conversation today probably is not going to do what you think it does in terms of the scene, because what I want to talk about is how your book ties together everything to go into the scenes. So you might find that to be an interesting and different process in the scheme of things. Since folks listening might not know this particular book, I wanted to read what your premise is. Let me see where I put this. This is from Amazon. So here we have Kama. I never expected to meet the one during my research dates for my thesis. And never in 1,000 free dinners would I have guessed I'd fall for a smooth-talking, ridiculously hot lawyer with fingers that massage my common sense right out of me. The problem is his career goals aren't just at odds with mine. If he succeeds, he'll destroy my reputation. Dylan, I've got a one-track mind and it's set on becoming my law firm's youngest partner ever. All I have to do is win a case the firm's president hand-delivered to me. Problem is, once I started researching the claim, I quickly realized that to get this promotion, I'll have to crush the most intriguing, infuriating, and attractive woman I've ever met. Now I have to decide which I want more, the goal I've focused on my entire adult life, or the woman my heart tells me I can't live without. So, does that truly encapsulate these two people for your story?
That sounds like a trick question. Does that truly encapsulate them? Yeah. I think it encapsulates each of their goals,
okay,
and the conflict. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that's great. This is verification. I'm doing verification. So in this, I want to tell you how I approached what I did with your book. First off, I had read the book. And then you and I had this conversation, and you said what to me?
I said, with like twitterpation in me, and not like the happy kind from Cinderella or Snow White, that kind of like anxious twitterpation. How'd I do with the scenes with sex? I really love my massage scene. And that was the one I was most curious about. Did I do well from a sex therapist perspective from all that you teach in that scene?
Okay, cool. So that's where you were when you said, "Will you do this for me?" So I read it. We had that conversation, and then I went, "Okay." So then I went back and read it. And for those of you listening and those of you who have the link, that 28-page paper that's sitting in there, 28 pages, 29 pages, 28 pages, are my highlights from Kindle. So I had them downloaded. And so this gives you across the story what my thinking was as I was reading these different things. And it may not make sense to you in terms of my hieroglyphics, but I took those things to have this conversation today. So that way you'll be able to look back at it and go, wow, that's an interesting, ridiculous. And boy, she can't type when she's right in on her Kindle trying to type little tiny things. So it makes it kind of interesting. So that was my process. Read it first, then read it with these notes, and then going back to pulling out some very specific things that I want to talk about that relates to the template. And I am thrilled that you brought up the massage scene, because I have wonderful, wonderful things to say about that. But what I want to do from that micro, I want to pull back to a macro, and I want to talk about the content of sexuality. Because a lot of times I don't think that people realize that sexuality encompasses more than they think that it does, which is why we keep zeroing in on the sex scene. So if we pull it back further, I want to read you 6 lines of a movie that many of you have probably seen, The Thomas Crown Affair. And these are the first words that are said in the scene. Woman, I want to talk to you about women, Mr. Crown. I'm sorry, women? You've yet to talk about women. I enjoy women. Enjoyment isn't intimacy. Well, intimacy isn't necessarily enjoyment. Well, how would you know? Has it occurred to you that you have a problem with trust? I trust myself implicitly. Yes, but can you trust other people? No, can other people trust you? You mean society at large? I mean women, Mr. Crown. Yes, a woman could trust me. Good. Under what extraordinary circumstances would you allow that to happen? A woman could trust me as long as her interests didn't run too contrary to my own. On society at large, if its the interests were to run counter to your own, yes, and women. Now, I bring that out at this moment because when we're talking about sexuality, we want to see how fast sexuality is established in the story. So in this sentence, I mean, we're talking, I want to talk to you about women. I mean, it is the first thing that's said, and we know that there's going to be information that's going to be specific, talking with someone about what they think, what they feel, what they experience, and all of this goes into that detail. So in your story, get ready to clap. Get ready to clap, because you were at, I'm going to see which page of notes I put this on. I had so many coming in different directions. Okay, chapter 1 at the 5th paragraph. Paragraph number 5. You address Dylan's body image assessed by a male client, which is really cool because that's an atypical direction for starting a point. And then at the 25th paragraph, you introduce dating. So what I want to say is that in chapter 1, in 2 specific places, body image relates to sexuality and dating relates to sexuality. And most people would never think that they've put sexuality in their story already. That's why I wanted to bring forward that you have been thinking about it the whole time, that you are putting sexuality at the very front in that direction to have that happen. So, yay, here we go. Are you surprised to hear that?
I am. I am. And also there's a little part of me that's like, oh, I'm always thinking about sexuality. Yay me. Is that
Yes,
weird?
that's exactly, because we carry that around with us. And if we want to pull out, know our characters so well that we can make the decision about at which point, at which time, at which thing that we want to bring descriptive information out for the characters, we have to know that part about them inside and out. Whether we put it all on the paper, it has to be within us, the author, no matter what. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about self-intimacy, I'm talking about sensuality, fantasy, sexual behaviors, gender, sexual orientation, pleasure, body image, and desire. And in your link, you have the picture of the, see, I don't have all my stuff together. You have your picture of all of the things. All of these things are elements that could be something that you would choose to pick up from your people. So what I did in looking at your story was to do a sexual assessment. So I asked the question, what is sexuality accomplishing in your story? So that isn't just the sex scene, you know, the way we just talked about that. This is, what is sexuality overall accomplishing in your story? And then what is it accomplishing in your scene? Because you have to understand the overarching part of where sexuality is going to fit in order to talk about and say, I did what I wanted to do in each of those scenes with those particular characters. So we're looking at how sexuality deepens the reader's understanding of the character and what we need to reveal to whom, what's the best way, what's the most vulnerable way, what is the human connection. So today we're going to talk about your story premise. We're going to talk about the relationship premise, which sexuality is a part of there. And then we're going to talk about sexuality anchored throughout the story with the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual descriptors. So I want everybody to hear me say, I truly believe you are a magical, magical story weaver. Yes, you, the person I'm talking to for this particular item. Does that surprise you?
Yeah, it does. It totally does. Because, well, I wasn't expecting that. I honestly wasn't expecting that. But I think because although I try to be intentional, I suspect some of that is unconscious. Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm with you. And I do think that storytelling can be innate and that you have this process that feels right to you in that direction. And now we're taking this to be intentional with this magical weaving that you already do, where you can say, I have control of this tool. And with this tool, look at these things that I can add into the process. So I know you and I had talked before about, I'm trying to remember which visual you said you liked hearing about the sexuality parts. Was it me talking about putting it on a clothesline? Did that part make
Oh,
sense?
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I want to stay in the clothesline world for the moment here. So when we talk about anchoring sexuality at the story, I want somebody to think, here's your end of your clothesline on this side, and here's your end of your clothesline on this side. If anybody knows what that is from the old-timey days. So we have our hanging parts here. Well, if we look at that as a plot, then you're going to be hanging, I don't know, a sheet. And then you're going to hang a bra, and it's going to be vertical and skinny. And then there's going to be a pair of pants. And then you're going to have, you know, all of these different things. And you're picking and choosing. And you're also watching where the story ebbs and flows by the weight of what those particular items are. this is part of the process of thinking about your lines of sexuality. So if we have that, clothes hanger here, and if the different types of clothes represent different things in sexuality, you can say, is it time to throw this in? Do I need a little more of that? Do I want some of that? For those of you that are in the thread world, I'm always looking at it as it's a weaving. Here's the thread that comes together and then wrapping things around it. So it has many strands to this particular thread, and it has to be there in order for you to work the sexuality. So, as I said, your story started it. You definitely have a thread because you did that in the very first chapter. It sits right there. We know that it's going to happen. But one of the things that I want to talk about, this comes out of StoryGrid. This comes out of Heather Whitaker's unified theory of writing, where all elements that are applied in the story are also applied at scene level. So that's why I moved from macro to micro, because when you have a scene, it is a microcosm of the whole story. That means that you've tied together all of the meanings that you want to have, the conflict and all of that, and it is embodied in the scene that you want to create. What people may not recognize is that in sexuality gives us a better picture of the person and how they move and how they do something than just telling us about it, because we see the nuance of what they're doing. So that makes information that you need to have about your character and their sexuality really, really important. So we've got the strands. We know that that's happening. And we know that you started that process, and we know what the conflict is. So when I read your story the first time, without knowing that I was going to do this, there was something that stuck with me that I couldn't shake. And then when you said, "Ooh, I want you to do this," I was like, "Oh, okay." So you can unmute because I want to have a direct conversation with you on this. I want to know how you came up with your premise for what Kama's situation was going to be.
I had read a nonfiction book by an economist, a Canadian economist.
Okay.
And I cannot recall what it was called. Oh, and it's such a great title. But it was about the fact that the assumptions that are made about college students and their sex lives, and it was about the economics of dating and the quid pro quo around what a man expects after a woman lets him buy her dinner, and the value of sex in relationship to the cost of the dinner. Okay. So that's what inspired me to create her as a character.
So here's the idea, and here's where that coming together. How did you, or where did you get your information on her as a psychology student and the processes that go on in the academia world?
I guess from my own bachelor degree, and then making assumptions and doing a little bit of online research about what goes into a master's degree thesis and how that process works.
So the reason that I bring that up, and this is us doing a sexuality assessment, is that in the United States, I can tell you, of all things that would occur, this thesis would never happen. And it
would. Good thing she's in Canada then.
That's a good thing she's in Canada. And the reason for that is because we don't allow research on sexuality. And for the title of the thesis and for all these wonderful things that you're bringing forward in that process that make it a fascinating story, I look at the realism piece about that to say, well, we also have contract issues. If there's a contract signed, since I live with an IP attorney, if there's a contract signed, this moves forward this way. And we have all these other things that have gotten in the way between who's the guy at the school and who's the woman at the school, and all of these different things. So I sat with that first part going, okay, I'm hanging here. But that wasn't the part that got me. The part that got me, and I feel like it's almost Ghostbusters, Ghostbusters, you're going to love this one. So we're in research mode with Kama. She is now in the restaurant with Dylan, and the panic attack occurs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, how did you set that up?
Gosh, what a question. How did I set that up? Meaning from how is it set up in the story, or are you thinking from how I created that?
Both. You can give us both.
If I can remember how I set that up. He uses an expression that triggers her panic attack. So he says something and she has this visceral reaction to it, and that puts her in that state of high adrenal, like panic. The description of her panic attack comes from my own personal experience of having had both epileptic seizures and then having been diagnosed many years later as having generalized anxiety disorder, which was not. It was in fact seizures again. So I took my own personal experience and the feelings that I would have and the reactions I would have when I was in that state of seizuring.
Gotcha. And that part feels unbelievably real in terms of the way that it was handled, the way that people responded to them in the restaurant, and having Sophie and Nick, be pulled into that direction as firefighters. But here's the part that made it more difficult, and for the sex anchor here at the beginning and now how it goes through, is that you tied the statement that he made when she said, "You're imagining me naked," and he says, "I am," and then she has the panic attack. You have tied the sexuality to the panic attack.
Right.
And so from there on, I'm reading the clues that you're dropping, and I'm going, okay, so now she says people should be more worried about who you get stuck with at home. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Sex, I'm naked, I had a panic attack, now I have this piece of information about this. So I'm starting down a whole road. What is it telling you that I'm going down?
You're going down, she was sexually abused at home by somebody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which she wasn't.
And she wasn't. That's not what the story has to do with it at all. But when you start thinking about your meanings about sexuality, and you're looking at exactly what you're layering in to have the reader go in a particular place. I mean, I'm going down the road reading this, going, wait a minute. Where's where I'm going with this? I was on this path and now I'm somewhere else. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the brother thing had to do with, and trying to pull it back together. And those are the kinds of things that from a sexuality assessment pull me totally out of the story, because I know too much. Now, other people may not have been pulled out of the story at that direction at all, but they may have some trying to figure it out to see, where things are going to go. So given that's my headset, I'm now reading sex scenes that you're putting together going, wait a minute. If she's got some issue here, I don't understand how sexuality is happening this way, which also puts her in her major professor says, you haven't dated, you don't know much about dating, you don't date. And I'm thinking to myself, now I'm totally confused. She doesn't date, but she's doing a thesis about dating. And she states that she's doing it for women at the front end. What does she say? You realize that you people, my friends, are the reason I'm doing this research. Well, what do you mean? Right. Tell me you wouldn't let him pay for dinner, go home with him and complete your economic exchange with whatever non-monetary assets you have to offer. Kama, sometimes the woman wants to have sex just as much as the man does, and I'm one of those women. And so then I sat here with, okay, wait, what is the reason? What is the meaning for the sex for her in the thesis? Because sometimes what happens is we have these broad ideas, but we don't pull it tight to make it into the relationship, to make it into the sexuality. So if we start looking at the sex history of both people, if I were to ask you, tell me her sex history, what does it look like?
Very naive and not a lot of it. I honestly, I did not reread my book, which I wrote 3 years ago. So you might know better what her sex history is from the hints in the story. But as I recall in writing it, I believe she's had one relationship.
Yeah, and that relationship gets addressed at the 69th percent part of the book. And so again, I'm trying to understand who she is as a person. I'm trying to get into her skin. And let me tell you, it was a lot easier for me to get into his skin than it was to get into her skin. And I think that that's the kind of part where in that author, where we're talking about author boundaries, I think you love Dylan.
Oh, you know, that's really funny. I love Nick. I love Nick the firefighter. I can say that. Um, I actually am going to tell you, I really connected with Kama. I was disappointed that readers didn't love her as much as I love her. What I like about Dylan, I don't think I love Dylan. What I like about Dylan is that he's actually a good listener and he's sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
He's got that.
What do you relate to Kama on?
Her insecurities.
Okay. Because I think if from a pacing direction, if there had been information about her dating, her sexuality, some things for the reader, not that she's given it to Dylan, but sometimes the readers want to have the secrets that the person doesn't know yet so they can feel closer to her. I felt there was a lot of distance from Kama, and one of the ways that showed up was that when you had Dylan talking with her, he'd fill in all of her feelings and thoughts about things rather than it coming out of her in that direction. So it was interesting to see how much of a fixer he was. Let me tell you how you feel about this. Let me tell you, where this is going to be. And he was bringing things forward, but the balance between the two felt off.
Interesting. Which is why you think I love Dylan, because I gave him this quality.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because let me get my phone out. I did this is hard doing this on Kindle, but I worked at it anyway. I went and I looked for specific words because I wanted to see how much language got utilized in a particular way. And I tell you, I recommend everybody do this in terms of looking at sexuality or any layering that you want to do for your people, is to check out the language that you're using. Dylan's name was mentioned 416 times. Kama's name was mentioned 459. So I looked at that going, who talked more about the other person as a balance component? And so I thought that was kind of interesting. And you're going to think I'm absolutely crazy when I tell you this, but I did not know until we hit the part in the story where Kama is sitting with her father in the garden and she talks about the Indian heritage.
No, I don't think you're crazy. You didn't realize that she was Indian, that she was Indo-Canadian. No.
I did. I got that. Maybe somewhere in the first third, I think I realized.
Thank you for seeing that, Misha. It was subtle, Dr. J. I don't think
it was crazy. Very subtle.
Because I was writing another culture, and because of where I live, and Indo-Canadians are a dominant culture, I wanted to write a character who was part of the culture I live in, but I didn't want. So I didn't make, and her culture is not. It is integral to her character, but not to the point, not to this relationship. So,
Well, it is in this sense. From a sex history direction,
Mhm.
whatever her family gave her about sexuality, any information that they've had about talking or anything would have played into this. So when I got to that place where it said, boom, here this is, now I go backwards going, all this great stuff that could have been added in for me to feel closer to Kama about what the struggle was she was actually having.
Right.
And I think that that was, you know, when we think about sex history and we think about all of the different items that were on the form that all of you have here, all of these things impact the way you think about sexuality, you feel about sexuality, where that fits in the relationship, and how that's going to come out in your actual movement to be a sexual person. And I think that when we take a look at those kinds of things, the richness of what we can provide occurs. And I say this from the beginning to the end because there could have been interesting descriptors of her physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually that told us more about her, or in dialogue, she said something about herself as revealing, but not because she meant to do it. You know, here's information that slipped out that wasn't intended at that particular time. And I think it's when you use the sex history and you think about the relationship components of what the family gave, then you have a clearer path to get to the meaning that you want to place within any scene where 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 people are going to come together for their sexual connection and the pleasure that they want to be having. What are the obstacles? What gets in the way? And those things are much clearer when you know that to start with. So even if a writer were to say the experience is limited, I mean, you, the writer, need to know how limited and in what way and in what details, because then you are powerful because you have this extra stuff that you'll be able to put in to highlight different kinds of things.
Mhm.
And I'm curious in terms of relationships, do you use any particular models to help make choices about how characters come together?
No, I wasn't aware there were any.
Oh, I was in a group where they're using all sorts of psychological models. And if you try this and you do this, and in the book, in my book, since I do sex research work, I use Helen Fisher's model because it's a brain model that deals with dopamine, estrogen, testosterone, and serotonin. And it gives us our personalities. And so her research shows that people who have who their personality leads with dopamine are attracted to people who lead with dopamine, and people who have serotonin as their lead are attracted to serotonin people. And estrogen and testosterone are opposites and they attract. So when you hear people say birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract, it's really that process. And there are great things that you can see people do. Dopamine is going to be, let's go climb Everest. Let's jump off the, you know, the bridge in New Zealand and bungee jump. I mean, these are people that are high energy and they do things together. And sometimes when you find those kind of connections, people in sexuality worlds, they're going to be the risky, more interesting stuff going on with dopamine than, and then the characters of serotonin are the home builders. I'm really stable. I have my group of friends. This is how I do things. And then you have estrogen is big thinking people. And testosterone is directed. This is what I'm going to do. You know, it's very pointed and all of this. And when you connect all these people, you recognize that in relationship connections, you have to have a complete relationship system. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book, because a lot of people don't consider how their characters hook and what makes the character in their body and in their physiology and in their mental part actually come together. Not just the attraction, you know, related to the, you know, the physical body, but there are other things that a lot of times in therapy, we call it borrowed functioning. So that means I'm with somebody who's going to pick up the slack for me in this area, this area, and this area, and I pick up the slack for them in this area, in this area, in this area. And it's how you look at yourself and you realize that it's all external versus how do you move into an internal direction. This shows up better in sexuality than in any place, because it's the, will you stand up and ask for what you want? Or are you dependent on somebody else bringing those things forward to you? So in your story, we're really seeing a delightful, if I could use it in that way, a delightful borrowed functioning couple working together. And in the end, I want to know how they each stand up to get what they want for their sexual self. And that's part of that relationship piece. It's part of the trust piece. It's part of the intimacy piece. So all of these things come together. So if we see that in the quote, quote, bedroom, we know that that has occurred as part of your story arc, the whole story arc.
So if there's a disconnect between a character who comes across as a dopamine-driven character and a serotonin-driven character, like if it's clear in the descriptions and their actions that we have those two, and then they come together, does that make their relationship less believable, even like subconsciously to the reader?
It's very possible, because you're dealing with different psychologies.
Mm-hmm.
The personality psychologies are different. You're looking at, you know how when we write scenes with sex, whatever, we're actually going to have some activity. You think of one person does this motion and the other person reacts. They can react physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. And they may not react the same way because they're not in the same plane of having the experience that the other person is having. Mm-hmm. So a high dopamine person, they may be pushing all the buttons. Let's do some BDSM. Let's do some of this other stuff. And the serotonin person may be going, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. So you might have let me get my picture in here. You might have a bigger disconnect than if they were in the same connection personalities that actually fit for personalities. And that's the cool part about writing, is that you can rewrite stuff to make it fit in that direction for them. So I bet this is not, go ahead.
To make it fit for them, then would you need, and sorry, this might sound really naive, but would you need the character to be like the dopamine character to be less dopamine, or the serotonin character to have more dopamine in there? No, like you can still make that fit.
Yeah,
bring them together.
Yeah, and then because of their family experience, their relationship experience, their sexual history experience, those are going to be the things that are going to cause the obstacles in here between them.
Right.
And that's what we want, as many obstacles as we can have so they can get past it and feel good about what they're doing. And those things come across in the romance story as well as in the bedroom. So that goes back to the overarching and the underwing. So when I looked at your premise for Kama and for Dylan, and then thinking about the brother being the trigger for her in that direction, those were far off from here.
Mm-hmm.
I look for how close can I get into the character so that I understand why they're picking that person, why they understand this person, what need are they trying to meet through that person, and how have I set it up to make that really have this pull as we're writing the story.
Right. So, okay, so she has got, I'm just curious, since you probably at this moment know my story more intimately than I do, like more clearly, but the contrast between how untrustworthy her brother is, mm-hmm. and how Dylan is written to be someone who she can trust, well, mm-hmm. except that behind the scenes he's got this secret thing going on and he's not trustworthy, but in the bedroom and mm-hmm. in relationship he appears to be very trustworthy. Mm-hmm. That was my thinking, but what I heard you just say was that, like, from a heart place, that disconnect was way too big. So somewhere in my plotting, now, was it in the plot or was it in the character?
I can answer that question for you, because if we look at the wound that her brother started, and now she's going, what'd she say, age 5? Now she's going through life for when this is happening, and now she actually attempts to be in a relationship. Here's where the accommodation starts happening and where things go wrong because of that. So we didn't have any information to show us how it went from the brother into relationships that she had, and then move that more closely to her. And now how is she working with Dylan? That's why sex history is so great. You have information to pull from for why they're behaving the way they are. And the thread is long.
So it would have been stronger than if in some of the scenes in her head or in her memories, in her thinking while she's with Dylan, she could have flashed back to how things had been with a previous partner, even if it was only one.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that process would be the connection to the reader going, oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I get that. I have a sense of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So is that helpful?
Oh, no, of course, because now I'm like, okay, now there's going to be a second edition of this story, because there has to be.
I didn't make you want to do that.
I don't mind rewriting at all. I mean, that is
I'll
the beauty
happily
of.
beta read if you do.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you, Misha.
And again, I really want to be clear with people. We had a conversation about what could you do to strengthen a story. I don't think this is a bad story. I never thought it was a bad story. I want to be absolutely clear. You know, you and I think are on target with that, but I want to make sure everybody else knows that. This was all about strengthening. This was not about tearing anything down, looking at the ways that you can add the sexuality part to give it the oomph that you need. So I had mentioned author boundaries when I had asked you the question about, did you like Dylan more than you liked Kama because of how the treatment of him was. One of the things that threw me was when, and I assume that this ties this back to the Indian culture, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to ask, when his big secret was he wanted to go to an ashram, was that the tie to the Indian world?
Not even necessarily. I mean, it's, how do I describe that? You know what, when I wrote it, I don't think it was. What I was drawing on was what is an intimate place that these two people can go to have a shared experience. And again, I mean, this is author, you know, admitting that I draw from my own real life. I've never been to an ashram, but I've been to places that are very like retreat centers that are very much designed like that experience.
And it's a lovely way to go about the connection. I mean, having them go there, have the experience that they did, it really was a connected thing. And then you use the humor of, oh, yes, we're going to sleep in that bed. No, you're not. That's not how this works. You're going to get this bed and you're going to get that bed and y'all are going to be together. And, you know, the highlight of your work is the comedy. I mean, I was laughing at, where did I put it? See, I got so many notes here. This one sentence I have looked at, I don't know how many times, and I giggle every single time I read the sentence. It sounded like I was being asked to stroke two men's egos with a grad student's hand. That is like the best. You have gotten into the sexual world right at it. And I was like, you have many of those throughout the story where people can, and it's woven in, and it's woven in related to the characters. So you naturally do what you're doing. I think it's now the direction to say, what is the meaning attached to each of the things? What, if I can have this thread here, and then I put a clothespin here, and a clothespin here, and a clothespin here, and these things are looping them together, because sometimes it felt like there was too much space and I forgot we were talking about this or whatever in the intimacy directions that they were going with. So that part was pretty cool. As an aside, you getting run over?
No, this is good. This is fabulous.
So I looked at the assessment of sexuality related to accurate facts within the story. And I did this because this woman sitting up here to my left on the screen says, I have something for you to look at. And she sends me another author's work and has clipped out this one part. And it is history about historical fiction, history about the use of vibrators for by medical doctors at a particular point in time. And I went, yes. And I'm reading it and I'm going, why did she put that in there? Because most people may not know, all of that has been debunked. In sex research, that is inaccurate information, totally doesn't exist, didn't happen, was made up. And here it is sitting in the middle of this big story that's out for the whole world to read. So big part. Misha's going big part.
An
So what
entire
I was looking
page.
I was looking at any things like that that may have slipped into the story, and there were only two minor items. And I bring these up as a sex therapist. Most of the work today, we now know that the clitoral body has a clitoral head, it has bulbs, and it has legs. Yes, and it looks just like that.
Like that.
I
Wait,
love
I'm
it.
in the way. There we go. There's my
there
little
it is. I love that you have that on your desk. I don't
right
even
there.
have one of those on my desk. I
So
have
yes,
other things, but I don't have
literal
that.
head and the
Yes,
bulbs.
there
and
you
the
go.
legs.
I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. So because of this new research that this is the structure that we have, people are now making the point that we may not have a G spot, that what those bulbs and legs that wrap around the vagina, so you have places that you could press, you're probably touching those areas instead. So all of that is the clitoris instead of just thinking about it as the G spot. So
Right.
some of that is just being on top of what the research or the different information has to do with. And as a sex therapist, I can tell you that the other place, besides are we naming the right body parts and whatever, are phrases that get us in popular media like sex addiction. There is no such thing as sex addiction.
Did I use sex addiction in my work? Did I use that?
You made a off. Kama made an off comment about tell a sex addict to stop masturbating. That Kama said that as a sentence.
I put it in the chat.
Thank you for putting it.
It's interesting because what we now know, I mean, I was there in 1982 when sex addiction was announced, and we're going to make money off of this process. And that's all it was we're going to use the AA model and we're going to do this. And it doesn't have anything to do with your body and the way alcohol addresses. And now the American Association for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists have come out with a formal statement to say the research does not support the use of the term sex addiction. It's obsessive compulsive behaviors. It isn't an addiction. So you tackle it from a different thing.
Right.
So I'm always looking for where people have utilized something that, you know, if they had more education about, they go, oh, why did I put that in there to start with? You know, it's just how we change our language or how we, you know, work that sex positivity so that we're not putting anxiety into other people or giving them a piece of information that may not be you know, what's happening in the big scheme of things. So I looked at those as specific items, just as a sex education direction. And as I said, I was looking at your work mainly from the anchoring sexuality, which I think most authors pay zero attention to, or they don't know how to do it, or they don't even know that it exists. You naturally have put that in your work. And I've read 4 of your books now, so I know that for sure. You just absolutely put that in there. So imagine in the driver's seat where you can say, watch me hook together the relationship, put the people's personalities into their relationships, tie the conflict that I'm going to present to them, whatever the wound is at this point in time. Now, where does the sex history support that wound? And how can the sex history information come into the scene, so I can have them moving through and being pleasured people in the end, whatever way they want to have that going on. I also loved how you used orgasmic as a descriptor for your scenes, rather than saying the I forget the sentence specifically. See, it's all kind of running in my head going, yeah, use that example, use that example. I can't believe I know how many examples I could do from your books. This is really cool. You didn't focus on orgasm as the end, but you were talking about the pleasure as orgasmic. So it was as if you were switching it off to say, it doesn't have to be penis, vagina, intercourse, and in here. We can have orgasmic pleasure and all of these interesting things that are going on. So you were even putting sexuality in a broader context for how two people could utilize that between each other.
That was, and the one that I think of is the massage scene, the orgasmic massage, where his penis has no role to play at all. And it's all about her pleasure. Yeah.
And I think in terms of, let's see, main thesis, premise, relational system. And you can see why I didn't stop. I mean, you asked me earlier this morning, do you want me to give them the specific scene that you're going to talk about? And I'm like, no, because that's not what I'm doing.
I get it now. Now I understand. Yeah.
Do you? Because that's what I was hoping was going to happen.
Yeah. It isn't. And it's a funny thing, like this whole idea of being conscious and intentional and then doing things subconsciously. I should have actually understood that you weren't just going to pull out one scene, because it is a laundry line, because that scene is so integral, or that scene is tied to all the things that come before and come after. Right. It can't be looked at independently.
Which makes the point, somebody pulls sex off the shelf and goes, let me insert sex here. It's like, you've missed everything, all this great stuff that you could use to talk about these characters.
Okay, so here's a question for you then, from an actual, like from a writing point of view. And I think I know the answer, but I'm just going to ask you because I know that other people might be curious. When I'm writing, pretty well all the time, I will put square brackets, insert sex scene here. I'm writing along and I get to the place where I have to have them be intimate and there is a sex scene. And I actually have to be in the right state of mind to write that level of intimacy, because it's less conversation. It's a different kind of writing for me. It's not that I'm not in their heads. It's the way I describe what's going on it feels, it's harder for me than having a conversation in a coffee shop or whatever. Yeah. So when, like you said, you can't pull the sex scene off the shelf, but do you have any cautions around pulling the scene with sex, in writing the scene with sex, not in the moment that it's, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. I know exactly what you're saying. And here's the thing. Anybody on listening could say, when I have had a sexual encounter, the front end of it, I felt this way. And at the back end of it, I felt this way, whatever that might be. And it could be a range of what people might feel. I had the best sex I ever had, the best orgasm I ever had. I feel wonderful. And boy, I was so tired when I started. So we have a character arc change in that direction. Or it could be the other way. I was excited. It didn't happen like I wanted it to. Oh my God, the orgasm didn't happen. I feel awful. So we got it going in the other direction. But here's what happens. In order for the story to continue with your characters, if you stop and don't write that at that moment, then whatever the experience they had with that doesn't get to go forward. You may have more information about the character with which to write the next scene and the next scene. So it's like stepping out of line and going, oh, wait, I was in line. What happened? Everything moved. So the process, even if you don't write the scene in a full scene direction, I use Diana Gabaldon's. It's all about conversation. It's all about the dialogue. What do you want these people to say to each other? And then it's embodied in between how their bodies are moving or what they want to do. But the dialogue is going to be there. Sometimes it's easier to put the dialogue in and then deal with different motions, movements, what we're going to do in that direction, because you have a notion of that. You have a notion of where the characters are going to go. But I would, at least with conversation, you're probably going to get a better picture of where they are finishing that scene and moving into the new one with new information, new ideas, new directions. And if you think about it like any other scene, it's just an embodiment in a different way. So we've been doing intimacy. You've been doing intimacy in this whole book. You've been doing it from any number of different directions. And I'm going to say, start looking more carefully at, am I just describing physical? Am I putting in what their emotions are? Am I discussing the conflict of the mental thoughts that they're having and what's getting in their way? Where do they feel at one with what's happening in this? So you're tying all of these things together for all of those 9 topics of sexuality. It's like, I have all of this to choose from. Which thing will I put in for this scene based on where I want the character to be when the scene is finished, to go into the next part of the story? Did that answer your question?
100%. That makes so much sense. And yes, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, Misha, I know you had your hand up, so hang on one second. Do you think this is a nice place for us to conclude and then we'll take questions?
If you feel like you've covered everything, I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot, and I know it sounded a little bit facetious, like writing the second, what is it called when you rewrite a book, or you do a second edition. Yeah, second edition. There's part of me that does want to do that, because I love this book, and I don't think it gets the love that I would like it to get. So it's very likely that doing a better job of weaving the intimacy and doing what you've just described in this book will help that story get the love that I would like those 2 characters to get. So I'm going to actually consider doing that. I think it's yeah. And obviously I'm working on a book right now. They have just met, like I'm 1 chapter past the meet cute, and I've already gone back to put in a little bit more about where they're starting from. I write many drafts through, right? And this was helpful, like knowing that 5 chapters in and 23 chapters in, there are elements of Dylan in here that helped you understand him, are going to help me do a better job with this work in progress. So I'm really grateful.
The other thing too that I didn't get to tap into much is that, each of those characters, anybody's characters, if you look at an entire sexuality continuum, their experience could be like, I'm at this place. And somebody else could say, I'm at that place. And your people meet at that place and that place. And that naturally causes tension, conflict, because we're not in the same place. And you can use all of those things sexually to be able to bring that forward. All the things I haven't done, all the things you have done, all the places where I have done it, all the places where you've not done it. I mean, any of those things can be elements in terms of the setting. But I know this can get overwhelming. So what I'd like to do is just close us out formally and to say, you have been the best sport ever.
Oh my gosh.
I was nervous. I told you that to start with, that this was going to be a fun thing because I was doing it with you, but it was still going to be, okay.
Well, I don't know why you were nervous, because, and you know what, I thought I would be nervous. I kind of set myself up to be nervous, but I think it's because it's you, and I knew that you would. First of all, I trust you implicitly. I trust your experience, and that you are going to be gentle and honest. So I
Was
actually,
I gentle?
well, you were. I think you were. You because it makes sense. I think that's part of it too, right? Everything that
Okay.
you said, it's like, this is just helpful. How can I be nervous about somebody helping me? So I ended up not being nervous at all. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here and doing this. Thank you all for being here. And you have information that Danica gets to look at later. And I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can see who wants to show their face and ask any comments or questions.